Hello everyone, welcome to e-GMAT. My name is Harsha and in this video we are going to discuss a question that I like to call Comput-o-mart. Now this is a weekend question, it's a very interesting question. So as always, first things first, let's start by solving this. Feel free to pause the video, solve the question and then let's resume. Alright, so this is a 700 level question. It is a question from GMAT Advanced, and what really makes this question tricky are the answer choices. The conclusion is easy enough to understand, the logic is clear, even pre-thinking is not really a problem. You could easily arrive at a couple of scenarios. What really causes confusion in this question are the answer choices. It's not just these very popular answer choices, that's A and B. Even option C, if you ask me, is actually tricky. And what actually makes these answer choices tricky is the fact that they are what I call loosely worded option choices. When I say loosely worded, I mean that these option choices are so vaguely written, so generically written that if you interpret these in your own way and then if you add your own assumptions, you could kind of force fit these options to seem like the correct answer. But that is not how critical reasoning works. A correct answer, like option E here, it should be a conclusive weakener. There should be no two ways about it. It should not be like in one interpretation it strengthens and in another situation it weakens. It should not be like in one situation it weakens and in another situation you're not sure it weakens. No. A real weakener can only be interpreted as a definite conclusive weakener. It cannot be interpreted any other way. Alright? And that's kind of the problem with A, B, and C. It's so loosely defined that you can do some level of verbal gymnastics to force fit these options to make it look like correct answers, but that's honestly the wrong way to go about critical reasoning. Now, because the answer choices are so tricky, pre-thinking becomes extra important. If you spend some time understanding the universe of the problem, free from the bias of answer choices, then when you're evaluating these answer choices, your analysis is razor sharp. It's easier to eliminate these incorrect answer choices. So these are some aspects that we are going to see in this video. I'm sure it's going to be useful for you. With that, let's get into it. Let's start by visualizing the argument. So firstly, the entire argument here is an advertisement by a company called Comput-o-mart. So let's read what this ad has to say. All right. Our competitors, computer salespeople, they are paid as per the value of the products they sell. So we're talking about the competitors of Comput-o-mart. They're salespeople who sell computers. What we're being told is their pay structure is such that they get paid as per the value of what they sell. In simple words, if I am one of these salespeople, if I sell $100 laptop, let's say I get $10 as commission. Now, instead, if I sell a $200 laptop, I will be getting $20 as commission. If you aggregate this overall in a month, if I sell, let's say 1 million USD worth of computers, then I may be getting a commission of 10k USD. Instead, if I sell 2 million USD worth of computers, then I may end up getting 20k USD as commission. So fundamentally, what I get paid is what I get paid is pretty much dependent on the value of the items that I sell. What does this mean practically? It means that I have a financial benefit if I can convince my customers to buy more expensive units. Simple. Imagine I'm the customer. Imagine that I'm the customer, and in reality, I need to buy only $100 laptop. This meets all my requirements. But if I go to this particular competitor, the salesperson in this particular competitor salesperson is going to try to convince me to buy a $200 laptop for his own financial benefit because he gets a better commission. That's the implication of the first two sentences. Whether I need it or not, I'm going to be somebody's going to try to convince me to buy a higher end laptop. It's as simple as that. Now let's move on. But here at Comput-o-mart, our salespeople, they are paid a salary that is not dependent on the value of their sales. So imagine that you are one of these salespeople. You earn, let's say, 10k USD in a month. What essentially this line tells you is, hey, this is your salary, this is fixed. This salary is not dependent on the value of your sales. In other words, whether in this particular month you sell 1 million USD worth of computers or whether you sell 2 million USD of computers, it makes no difference. Your salary is still 10k USD. It's as simple as that. Okay. So fundamentally, what you're being exposed to in these two sentences, in these three sentences, is the difference in the pay structure for the salespeople between Comput-o-mart and the competitors, and the implication of that is in salesperson behavior. The competitor salesperson is going to try to convince you to buy the more expensive products, whereas Comput-o-mart people, they will not try to tell you what to buy. This is the fundamental difference that the author is trying to drive home. Okay, so the Comput-o-mart salesperson, because they don't have any real financial incentive of this sort, they're not going to try to tell you what to buy. As a result, the main conclusion that is being drawn based on all this is that, hey, that means when you being the customer, when you buy a computer at Comput-o-mart, you can be sure that you are not paying for computing capabilities you do not need. So these other guys are going to push those expensive units at you, which probably have higher end computing capabilities. But here at Comput-o-mart, you're not going to end up paying for those kinds of things, because we're not going to push those kinds of things at you. That's fundamentally what is being said here. This last line is, of course, the main conclusion. Now, what is it that we are asked to do in this question? Which of the following would, if true, most weaken the advertisement's reasoning? So when you say you have to weaken the reasoning, let's understand what that means. So you have all these premise statements: premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and premise 4, and all this is fundamentally the reasoning. Based on this reasoning, there is this conclusion that's being drawn. If you want to weaken the reasoning, all you have to do is to attack the linkage between the premise and the conclusion. So in other words, even if all this premise is true, when can you not really make this main conclusion? When can you not claim this particular claim that is the main conclusion? If you can drive a wedge between the premises and the conclusion that's being drawn, that's nothing but weakening the reasoning. So in terms of approach, it means the same. It's weakening the argument, weakening the reasoning. It does not really make too much of a difference. That's what we're going to see. So the argument is clear, the question is clear. Now let's spend a little bit of time visualizing the conclusion, because it's important. The conclusion says, when you buy a computer at Comput-o-mart, you can be sure that you're not paying for computing capabilities you don't need. So quite a few things to unpack here. First, we're talking about computers. Comput-o-mart may also be selling printers for all you know, but we don't care about that. Second, though the logic that we discussed, the premises that were used is fundamentally a difference, a comparison between Comput-o-mart and its competitors. The pay structures are being compared, and based on the pay structure, the salesperson behavior is being compared. It's based on that difference in behavior that the conclusion is being drawn. So while the premise is a comparison between Comput-o-mart and its competitors, the conclusion itself is specific to Comput-o-mart. If you notice, it's not about Comput-o-mart versus its competitors, it's about what happens when you buy a computer at Comput-o-mart. Again, small things you need to pay attention to. Third, there seems to be an intrinsic assumption that's happening here, that is regarding computing capabilities. Now, if you go back to the premises, all the logic tells you, everything that's being told is that the competitor salesperson, they will try to push the more expensive products on you, right? Whereas Comput-o-mart salespeople are not going to do any such thing. Based on that, the conclusion is not talking about more expensive computers, it's talking about more computing capabilities. So there seems to be some intrinsic assumption here made by the author, that is Comput-o-mart here, that at least typically expensive computers mean higher computing capability computers, at least typically in most cases, because only then does the logic really work, does the argument really make sense. Because coming back to the argument, it's all about this difference in sales behavior. One group of salespeople, this is a competitor salespeople, they're going to push expensive units at you. Comput-o-mart salespeople are not going to do that. Based on that, you're claiming that the claim is that a customer will not end up paying more for computing capabilities. So the author is intrinsically assuming that more expensive must at some level imply more computing capabilities at some level. This assumption is being made, all right? Something that again we need to pay attention to. These are intrinsic assumptions. Finally, this is point 3. A final point that's very important is, again, the conclusion is very specific to one aspect of computers, that is computing capabilities. There are so many other aspects of computer. For example, the conclusion is not about paying more for storage capacity. It's not about paying more for battery performance. It's not about any of those things. It's specific to one aspect, that is computing capability, or maybe it's the same as processing power. Okay, so that's about it. We have unpacked the conclusion. Now let's spend a little bit of time understanding the logic a little better. The logic here is fairly straightforward. It's a very simple argument that way. On what basis does the author say that, hey, if you buy a computer with us at Comput-o-mart, then you will not end up paying more for computing capabilities which are excessive to your requirement? On what basis is that being said? It's purely based on the behavior aspect of salespeople. It's based on the salesperson's behavior. So because of the difference in pay structure, competitor salespeople, for their own financial benefit, they will try to convince you to buy expensive units, whereas Comput-o-mart salespeople will not do so. And because Comput-o-mart salespeople will not push you to buy anything, when you're here, when you're at Comput-o-mart, you will not end up buying something which has a computing capability which is excessive to what you need, really required. So you're not going to be pushed to buy something in excess of what you need. Therefore, you will not end up buying something in excess of what you need. That's the core underlying logic here. If this is clear, let's do pre-thinking. So this is a weekend question where we want to weaken the reasoning. And again, what do we mean by weaken the reasoning? We want to kind of drive a wedge between the premise and the conclusion. In other words, when can this logic about salesperson's behavior not be used to derive the particular conclusion that's here? So or in other words, when can the fact that Comput-o-mart salespeople are not going to push products in my face, when can that not be used to justify the claim that when you buy a computer at Comput-o-mart, you will end up paying more because you buy things with more excessive computing capabilities? So when can you not make that kind of a conclusion? So that's simply all you need to find. When the simple question that you need to ask here is this: when will Comput-o-mart customers still end up buying computers which have computing capabilities beyond, in excess of what I need, even though the sales based on behavior is this way? Even though salespeople at Comput-o-mart are not going to be pushing or trying to convince me to buy expensive items or even items with higher computing capabilities, when will I as a customer still end up buying something which has a computing capability which I do not need? This is the only question that you need to find the answer to. Any answer to this is an effective weakener. So here are two situations that we could think of. Now, firstly, there is an underlying assumption here which is being made that Comput-o-mart as a company sells only sells not just these super expensive computers which have excessive computing capabilities, they also sell the regular type of computers. Now let's understand this with an example. See, let's say in the world of computers, let's say there are 6 models: A, B, C and X, Y, Z. Alright, A, B, C, let's call them as basic computing models. What do I mean by basic computing? Most people like you or me, regular individuals, ABC meets our requirement. We don't need anything which has a computing capability beyond what ABC provides. So let's call this basic computing. Now you also have these high-end models that are X, Y, and Z. These are, let's call this advanced computing. So this is beyond what regular people normally require in their day-to-day usage. So very few, it's a very small state of people that actually require a computer of this level of computing capability. So it's in excess of what most people require. So let's say this is the entire computer market of the world. Now, at some level, this argument is assuming that there is a healthy mix of both these types of computers being sold at Comput-o-mart, because otherwise this entire logic becomes irrelevant. So imagine a situation where Comput-o-mart doesn't sell A, B or C. It only sells these super expensive advanced computer models which have computing capabilities far beyond what is required for the typical user. What if this particular company, that's Comput-o-mart, sells only X, Y and Z? In such a situation, does this premise even matter? Does it not become irrelevant, irrespective of whether Comput-o-mart salespeople will be pushing expensive products like XYZ or not? Doesn't matter. So what if they do not push? Still, the only options available are X, Y, and Z. As a customer, I will still end up buying one among X, Y, or Z. In other words, whatever, irrespective of the given premise, I will end up purchasing a computer which has a computing capability which is far above my requirement. So Such a situation would effectively weaken my reasoning because it completely nullifies the premise that's given. It makes the premise completely irrelevant. So this is one situation that we could think of. Another situation that we could think of is about the customer side behavior. So the logic is entirely predicated on salesperson behavior, but customer behavior is a separate beast altogether. Think about it. Just because a customer is just because a salesperson influences a customer and tries to convince a customer to buy a product does not mean that I as a customer will buy that product, right? What if what if the salesperson's attempt at influencing me has absolutely no impact, irrespective of whether you influence me or whether you try to convince me? I'm not gonna buy as per that influence. I'm going to buy as per what I want. That's a situation. That's also a realistic situation, right, in real life. So what if the situation is such that customers are not at all influenced by salespeople trying to push a product, and in the case of Comput-o-mart, the customers actually prefer, or in other words, actually want a product like X, Y, or Z. Now, here is where I'm actually making a very subtle distinction that's very important to understand. There is a difference between what someone needs versus what someone wants. So I am a regular individual. Technically, if I buy a computer, I need only a basic computing model. So I need only something like A, B, and C. But that's what I need. In reality, I might want one of the higher level computers, right? Just because I need something does not mean I want the same thing. I might want something much better. So there is a difference. What that means here is, irrespective of the salesman pushing or not pushing, or irrespective of this entire logic that's being used to make this conclusion, I as a customer may still prefer to buy high-end computer models like X, Y, or Z, which have computing capabilities beyond what I require, and I may not actually require it, but I may still want it. If that's the situation, if most of Comput-o-mart's customers belong to this particular category of people who don't need a higher computing but actually want a higher category, and they'll buy a higher category computer even if they're not pushed towards it. In such a situation, yet again, irrespective of the salesperson behavior, the customer is still going to buy, somebody like me is still going to buy a computer like X, Y, or Z, which has a computing capability beyond what I actually require. So it again weakens your argument, and it drives a wedge between the premise and the conclusion. So these are two situations that we could think of. These are both effective weakeners. There could be more, but with this understanding, let's go to answer choice analysis. This is where things will really get tricky if you're not careful. Now, let's look at option A. It's the second most popular correct. It's the second most popular incorrect answer choice. So what's option A all about? It says some less expensive computers, they actually have greater computing power than more expensive ones. So if you chose option A, I can understand what your underlying thinking was. So fundamentally, let's understand option A first before thinking about why you might have chosen this. So let's again talk about the computer market. Let's say you have A, B, C, and then X, Y, Z. Okay. As discussed, A, B, C are kind of basic level computing. They do not have that. They are cheaper models which do not have that level of computing. X, Y, Z are advanced level and they are expensive. Now, what option A says is, hey, there are these other models P and Q. At least some models exist which we call as P and Q. P and Q are less expensive, so they are more, as far as budget is concerned, they are more similar to A, B, and C because they're not that expensive, but they actually have greater computing power than even X, Y, Z. So this is a P and Q of products, computers which are less expensive, but actually have greater computing power, greater computing capability. End of the day. So here's what you might have thought if you chose this particular answer as the correct answer. All right, this particular choice is the correct answer. So hey, there are these computers called P and Q. They are less expensive, but they have greater computing power. So given that given that you have these computers, a smart customer, you're assuming that most customers will be smart. Customers will end up buying these computers. And if a customer is ending up buying P or Q, what does that mean? Essentially, I bought a computer that has a higher computing capability than what I require, because P and Q have higher computing capability than even the expensive ones at XYZ. Or in other words, as a customer, I am actually buying greater computing capability than I require. Therefore, it kind of goes against the conclusion. This might have been your thought process, but if you thought this way, then you have not thought through option A deeply. It's incorrect. Let me explain why. Firstly, option A only tells you about the existence of these kinds of alternatives, which are not as expensive, but at the same time, which actually have even greater computing power. Just the existence of cheaper alternatives does not in any way indicate that customers will actually buy these. Your entire logic in choosing option A is dependent on customers buying these particular models, but just the fact that they exist does not mean that they will be bought, right? Uh, Even whether it's from a customer behavior perspective or from a salesperson behavior perspective. All right, so these cheaper options called PQ exist. The question is, how does it impact salesperson behavior? Here's the point. If you are a competitive salesperson, let's assume that I am a competitor salesperson. I am still going to push XYZ. Why? Because they are the more expensive units. And as per the argument, the salespeople at Comput-o-mart, they are not going to do any kind of pushing because their pay is not dependent on any of these things. So the fact that P and Q exist does not have any impact on salesperson behavior. That's first aspect. Now let's talk about consumer behavior. Does just the fact that a cheaper alternative exists, which also has greater computing power, does not automatically guarantee that a customer will end up buying these alternatives. I'll tell you why. I'll give you a simple example. There may be a perception of poor quality. All right, you're giving me a fantastic computing power for a very cheap price. I might perceive this to be a case of poor quality product which is being pushed based on computing power, supposed computing power. I may still not buy that product. You cannot in any way assume that these products will be sold. That's the first problem. There is another problem, it's more subtle. Even if these products are bought, even if customers actually buy such computers, it does not really weaken the conclusion. Now, why do I say that? Because the conclusion is not that you, the conclusion is not that a customer will end up buying computers with greater computing capabilities. It's that a customer will not end up paying for such computing capabilities. What is the difference? If I buy PQ, definitely I bought a computer which has a computing capability that is not required for me. But did I actually pay for it? Did I actually pay something extra for this additional excessive computing capability? No. I paid pretty much the same. I could have paid pretty much the same as what I paid for ABC, what I would have paid for ABC. It's not that I paid for this extra computing capability. I just got something fairly cheap, right? So yet again, you cannot just say that this translates to even if I bought these computers, it does not translate to me paying for these computing capabilities. So these are the main problems with option A. Firstly, it doesn't mean the existence of these models doesn't mean that these models will be bought, nor does it mean even if it is bought, it does not actually weaken the conclusion. All right. So, like I said, very detailed analysis of option choices in this particular question. Very, very important. Now let's move to option B, which is the most popular incorrect answer choice. So option B says salespeople who have a financial incentive to make sales, they generally provide more attentive service than do other salespeople. Now, just like option A, option B is also what I call as a very, very loosely worded option choice. The problem with an option like this is we tend to force fit an option like this to fit the context and to make it right rather than option B actually being right. So if you chose option B, I'll tell you what made you choose option B. So as per the argument, who are the salespeople who have a financial benefit with regard to sales? Obviously, it's the competitor salespeople. That means that you might have assumed that means these other salespeople refers to not the competitors but the actual company, Comput-o-mart salespeople. So fundamentally, option B at this, if you simplify option B, you might think that hey, competitor salespeople provide more attentive service than Comput-o-mart salespeople, and then you would have thought that hey, if Comput-o-mart salespeople are not paying attentive service, then that means they do not actually understand what is the requirement of their customers, or in other words, they do not actually understand what is the optimum computing capability that this particular customer wants, and as a result, these customers will end up buying higher end computers which have greater computer capability than what they want, and as a result, it's a weakener. This is the entire chain of thought if you chose this option choice. But the problem is, even as I said this, you should probably get a feeling that I'm having to do a lot of verbal gymnastics to make this option work. Now let's put bullet holes in option B and see why it does not work. All right. So the first aspect that's of interest is option B talks about financial incentive to make sales. Now, as per the argument, of course, we know that the competitor salespeople, they have a financial incentive to make sales. It's based on the value of the products they sell. This does not necessarily mean that Comput-o-mart salespeople do not have any financial incentive to make sales. They do not have a financial incentive tied to the value of the products they sell. They might have a financial incentive which is not tied to the value. I'll give you a simple example. For all you know, uh, as far as Comput-o-mart is concerned, absolutely no worry about the actual value of goods sold. You can sell the cheapest units, we don't care. But if you sell 50 units, you get a particular bonus, that's B1. If you sell 100 units, you get double this bonus amount, 2B1. And if you sell 150 units in a month, you'll get triple the bonus, that's 3B1. So it's not, so in such a case, for example, they do have a financial incentive to make sales, just that it's not dependent on the value. So the argument only tells us that Comput-o-mart salespeople do not have any value-based financial incentive to make sales, but they could have an incentive that's based on the number of units they sell. They could sell the cheapest units, but there could be this bonus component that they could avail. So fundamentally, what is the implication? The first assumption that you made, that hey, other salespeople here should refer to Comput-o-mart salespeople, is actually incorrect. You cannot assume that, because for all you know, Comput-o-mart salespeople also have a financial incentive to make sales. That's the first problem. The second problem, the word attentive service is way too generic. It's open to all kinds of interpretation. In reality, attentive service can mean anything from serving tea and coffee and juice to your waiting customers, making sure that your customers get a seat to sit on while they wait, all the way to understanding the optimum requirement of your customer and giving perfect product recommendations. So the scope of attentive service is way too broad. You don't know what it actually applies to. That's a red flag in itself. Now, another red flag is the comparison that's given here. Now, all option B tells you is one type of salespeople, those who have a financial incentive to make sales. Let's assume that is a competition, and let's assume other salespeople refers to Comput-o-mart salespeople, though we have already seen it's not the case, not necessarily the case. So let's assume that the competitor salespeople provide more attentive service that's given to us. So on a scale of 1 to 100, salespeople who have, I mean, the competitor salespeople may be having a rating of 95 out of 100 in terms of the attentiveness of the service, whereas the other salespeople or the core company, Comput-o-mart salespeople, may still be providing an attentive service, a level of attention that's 90. Now, 90 out of 100 might still be pretty good. You cannot just assume that just because the level of attention is lesser, it's not necessarily less. It could still be more than good enough to ensure that the salespeople understand what is truly required for that particular customer. So again, if you are just assuming that attentives, because they are providing less attentive service, that means that they have not understood the requirement. Not necessary. Lesser does not imply less. Whatever the attentive service they are providing right now, even that might be good enough for this purpose. Another red flag. Now the final red flag here is again related to the final assumption that you might have made, that is, hey, okay, the Comput-o-mart salespeople, they are not providing attentive service. As a result, they may not really understand the optimum computing capability of these customers, and as a result, you might have assumed that the customers will end up buying higher level computers than what they need, which have more computing capability than the requirement. But again, honestly, the lack of attentive service can lead to either all of these possibilities, any of these possibilities. I could buy something that is way beyond what I require. I could buy something that is way below what I require, or I could still end up buying exactly what I require. The fact of the matter is, irrespective of what level of attention is given to me, I as a customer might end up in any of these buckets. You cannot conclusively say that the customer will end up buying a higher level of computer, higher level of computer, higher level of computing capability. Not necessary. I could end up in this scenario as well, for example. And therefore, it's not conclusive enough to be a weakener. So I've given you at least 4 reasons why option B is not a correct answer. If you assume all these aspects, these are all the logical jumps that you made to force fit option B into a correct answer. So I hope there is an important lesson here. Do not try to force fit, approach logically and see if it actually fits. So let's go to option C. Option C is also a slightly interesting option for me because again, to make this work, there's a lot of force fitting that's required, which should not be happening. So option C says extended warranties which are purchased for less expensive computers can cost nearly as much as the purchase price. Again, let's take the example that we used, A, B, C and X, Y, Z. So as always, XYZ is the advanced level computers, ABC are the basic level computers, basic computing capability, what most customers require. Now, what option C tells you is extended warranties purchased for less expensive computers can cost nearly as much as the purchase price of the computer. What it's trying to say is, let's say in the case of A, B and C, it can cost a lot more. So it's not just the cost of buying A, B, and C. You might also incur a very high cost with regard to the extended warranty that also gets purchased. Fine, but does this necessarily mean? Does this necessarily weaken the conclusion? Not quite. Let's understand why. So, if you first let's discuss why you might have chosen an option choice like this. So you might have assumed firstly one thing that you might have assumed is, hey, because extended warranties are actually adding so much to the cost, they cost nearly as much as purchase price, they're kind of expensive. You might have assumed that this makes it more expensive than the advanced models, and as a result, if I as a customer, I will end up purchasing the advanced model rather than going for this model. Think about it. If A, B and C along with their extended warranty, it's going to cost pretty much as XYZ. Why will I buy A, B and C? I would rather buy XYZ. This might have been your thinking. So end of the day, I am essentially ending up buying X, Y or Z, which has greater computing capability than I require, which essentially will weaken your conclusion. So you might have thought that you might have thought that the extended warranty makes the cheaper products, makes the less expensive computers cost prohibitive, pushing customers to buy XYZ. Or another aspect that might have happened here is the perception of quality. Because the extended warranties for these less expensive computers are so expensive, one might perceive a typical customer might perceive these products to be poor quality, and as a result they might avoid this altogether and again go and buy XYZ. And if they are buying XYZ, that means that they are paying extra for computing capability they do not require. So either with regard to the cost aspect or with regard to the quality aspect, you might have assumed that this would actually weaken the conclusion. But here is the problem. Problem number one: you do not know the level of cost that is being added by the extended warranty and how it compares to the expensive models. Now, for example, despite the extended warranty, so let's say the cost of this particular one of these computers. Let's take computer A. It's a less expensive model. Its cost is C, and it's let's say that the extended warranty also costs pretty much C. So let's say C. So somebody ends up paying 2C, right? But what if the bare minimum cost of any among X or Y or Z, let's take X for example, is already 5C? You do not know how the cost of these models compares to the cost of the more expensive models, even along with the warranty. In this case, even in a case like this, I would happily simply buy the cheaper one if I am a very cost sensitive customer, right? So just the fact that extended warranty is somewhat pricey does not tell you that the cheaper computers are going to be less preferred as compared to the expensive computers. Not necessary. Likewise with quality, just because even if this particular extended warranty is a signal of poor quality, it does not mean that the customers will automatically gravitate towards X or Y or Z. You don't know that. For all you know, most of Comput-o-mart's customers cannot even afford XYZ. They'll be happy to buy ABC even if the quality is slightly crappy, right? So you cannot, based on what option C tells you, you cannot assume that people will just automatically start buying the more expensive products, and that's fundamentally the easiest way to reject option C. There is another reason to reject option C, and this is related to the word can. So all I know is extended warranties for lesser expensive computers, they can cost nearly as much. So it's not necessary that in all cases they cost. So for all you know, out of A, B and C, in the case of A it definitely costs a lot more, but in the case of B and C it does not cost that much. Now here's the problem. As far as a Comput-o-mart is concerned, you don't really know which models are being sold in Comput-o-mart. For all you know, in Comput-o-mart, these advanced models are being sold. These models that are B and C might be sold. A, which is the computer where the extended warranty actually adds a significant cost factor. This particular model may not even be sold in Comput-o-mart. So you're not even sure whether the entire logic of extended warranty will definitely apply to Comput-o-mart. So that's another red flag for you. So yet again, if you're falling for this, go through the logic that we have discussed. There are so many places where you have to interpret it in your own way. You have to make your own assumptions. You have to assume that the cost here is significantly it's not significantly lesser than the cost of the expensive. You have to assume that quality is a very serious factor. All these assumptions that you have to make one option choice work, it's a red flag. A real weakener will not have this many logical jumps. All right, so this is option C. Now let's come to option D. After A, B and C, D is actually a breeze. It's very easy to eliminate. Option D says Comput-o-mart is open only limited hours, which makes it more difficult for people to buy computers than compared to other retail stores. This is easy to eliminate because it is completely irrelevant. Irrespective of how difficult it is for these shoppers to buy computers from Comput-o-mart, does not matter. They may still be buying computers with more computing capabilities. Nothing that's mentioned in option D actually even connects to the reasoning or the conclusion that is drawn in this particular question. So option D is the easiest option to eliminate, which brings us to the only correct answer, the only proper conclusive weakener here that is not loosely defined, option E. And option E is one of our pre-thought ideas. It says Comput-o-mart does not sell any computers that sell only basic computing. Why does this work? This is exactly what we discussed, right? So the assumption that is being made fundamentally is that, hey, it's not just the complicated models, not just the advanced computing models that are being sold, it's also the basic computing models. But if Comput-o-mart does not sell basic models, it only sells the super expensive high level computing models which are out of reach, which are not necessary for most of the customers, then the entire logic fails. You cannot use the logic of salesperson behavior to make this particular conclusion. So this effectively weakens the reasoning. So a lot of learnings here. Again, be very careful with answer choice analysis. In this question, the conclusion logic, all of those were fairly straightforward. The only trick is in the answer choices. As we said, A, B and C are all loosely worded, and if you interpret it in your own way, if you make your own assumptions, it's very easy to force fit these answer choices to seem like a correct answer, but that's not how CR works. So make sure that you analyze what you have, you be open to all possible interpretations and figure out if a particular answer choice is actually correct. All right. So continuing on that point, if you are making a lot of logical jumps, it's always a red flag. If you're having to assume this, if you're having to assume that, a couple of reasonable assumptions in a strengthen or weaken question is par for the course. But if you're having to make all kinds of assumptions to make something stick, it's a red flag. Be extremely careful about very generically worded sentences or phrases, like for example attentive service. Like I said, it could mean anything from serving tea and coffee all the way till knowing exactly what product is required and giving optimum recommendations. Likewise, right, just the existence of alternatives does not tell you anything about whether people will actually go for these alternatives. So these kinds of logic traps are things that you should be very careful about. This is what I call as jumps in logic, traps in logic. If you just to automatically assume that the fact that something exists means that something will be bought, that's a trap. So you have to be aware of these kinds of traps. Those are red flags that you see across not just strength and weekend questions, across all types of CR questions. And again, be extremely careful with inferring specific meanings from generic terms. Now, for example, yet again, financial incentive to make sales. The argument only talked about the competitor salespeople in the context of their sales being, their pay being tied to the value of the goods they sell. Nobody told us that Comput-o-mart salespeople do not have any kind of financial incentive to make sales. This particular phrase is extremely generic. You have to be careful about interpreting this as well. All right. So I hope this video was helpful. There's a lot that we unpacked here. If you like this video, consider clicking on like. If you want us to do more content of this sort, tackle more such questions that have a lot of logical overtones, do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. It will tell us that you like this kind of content. And with that, as I always say, happy learning.